Hello and welcome. In this lecture, I will talk about the life, works, and philosophy of English idealist philosopher Thomas Hill Green, who, in a very short span of his lifetime, left an everlasting contribution to the philosophy in general and political philosophy in particular. Thomas Hill Green was born in Birken, Yorkshire, England, in 1836. After receiving his early education, he was sent to Balliol College, Oxford, in 1855. There he came under the influence of Benjamin Jowett. Jowett is believed to be the first English scholar to introduce Hegel's writings in Oxford. And it is widely believed that it was due to Benjamin Jowett that Green was initiated into the philosophy of idealism, and later Green realized that there was an immediate necessity to modify the German idealism by making it palatable to English taste so that it is widely accepted. In 1860, Green became a tutor at Oxford and later was appointed White Professor of Philosophy in 1878. The White's Chair of Moral and Ethical Philosophy of Law at the University of Oxford is, even today, considered the most prestigious chair of moral and ethical philosophy in the world. As a White Professor of Philosophy at Oxford, he lectured extensively in the areas of ethics, metaphysics, and history of philosophy. His first significant article, The Philosophy of Aristotle, appeared in 1866, and it marked the beginning of a number of his works that resulted in elevation of his personal influence at the Oxford. As an active political figure, he was elected to the Oxford Town Council, where he contributed a lot in creating civic amenities for the British people. He also campaigned for the British Liberal Party. He became very famous for opening a coffee tavern to popularize the temperance movement. It was a movement to discourage the use of alcoholic beverages that were eating up the British society. It was thus his real life experience as a member of the Oxford Town Council that made him a real liberal democrat and helped him better understand the nature of state. About his indulgence as a social and political activist, he himself observed that it requires a good deal of disinterested devotion to civic duty if the modern democracy is to work successfully. Unfortunately, Green died at a very young age of 46 years in 1882 due to septicemia. During his short span of lifetime, he left an indelible mark in the domain of political philosophy by starting the English Idealist School, which was later taken ahead by his pupil friends like Bernard Bosanquet, F.H. Bradley, A.C. Bernard, and R.L. Nettleship. Now here I will mention some of his famous works. Except for few articles, papers, and his famous introduction to Hume's treatise of human nature, Green did not publish any of his work during his lifetime because of his untimely death due to septicemia. The lectures that he delivered first as the tutor and then as the White Professor at Oxford University were posthumously published. Prolegomena to Ethics is one of the prominent works attributed to him. It was published in 1883, exactly after 1 year of his death. The manuscript was nearly complete at the time of his death in 1882, and Green had left the charge to edit and publish it to A.C. Bradley, a Balliol Fellow and friend of Green at Oxford. It was Bradley who developed the manuscript into an introduction and 3 symmetrical chapters. Bradley's only alteration of the manuscript is the breaking of larger paragraphs into smaller ones, which he admits in the preface that it was his desire to make no change except in passages which I felt sure Mr. Green would have altered had his attention been called to them. The main theme of Prolegomena to Ethics is the idea that human perfection exists in divine spirit, and its communication to man is the means by which human self-consciousness attains eternal consciousness, which is the divine principle of God. Shortly afterwards, R.L. Nettleship's standard edition of his works, the Lectures on the Principles of Political Obligation, appeared in literary circles and soon became a standard textbook on political theory in Great Britain and United States of America. The book has attracted philosophers, sociologists, and others since the day of its appearance and continues to fuel lively debates even today. It became the most popular work of Thomas Hill Green. Its object is to demonstrate on the basis of his philosophy the ethical position of the state and the obedience to its law as morally obligatory. Now let us find the major influences on Thomas Hill Green. When we talk about the major influences, we find that as a student at Balliol College, Oxford, Green was, as a matter of fact, influenced by Benjamin Jowett. Jowett had been one of the first to bring the writings of Hegel to Oxford, and it was through him that Green was introduced to German idealism. Afterwards, as a tutor, professor, and as an active politician, his philosophic discourses were apparently influenced by many classical and contemporary thinkers. Professor Ernest Barker identifies 4 profound sources which acted as stimulus for Green's lectures and works. Professor Barker identifies the influence of Greek classics as the first major source in Green's thinking. The Greek classics, like the Republic of Plato and the Ethics and Politics of Aristotle, were part of the curriculum at Oxford. They had an impact on him, both while as a student and as a tutor. Professor Barker assigns second place to the German idealism. Green was influenced by German idealism represented by Immanuel Kant and Friedrich Hegel. From Hegel, Green derived the main metaphysical idea that the universe is a single eternal activity and one spiritual self, conscious being that participates in the nature. Hegel provided him with the basis for the philosophical idealism. Green wholeheartedly believed in the existence of Hegel's divine spirit or reason. This to him was the vital truth which Hegel had to teach. In the ethical and moral aspect of his philosophy, Green chose to follow Immanuel Kant and his idea of free moral will, in virtue of which man always wills himself as an end. It is widely believed that Green was Kantian, who read Kant with Hegelian spectacles. Professor Ernest Barker assigns third place to Rousseau and his theory of general will as a profound source of inspiration for Green. Green was greatly influenced by the views of Rousseau that the state or sovereign represents the general will and as such is entitled to obedience. Green describes common consciousness as general will. Finally, Professor Barker identifies nonconformists or the free church as a profound source on his political thinking and in his views on temperance, property, morality, etc. Green was greatly influenced by nonconformists, though he himself belonged to established church. Now, after talking about his main works and the most profound influences that provided the much needed stimulus to Green, let us move ahead and try to identify the main aspects of his general philosophy. In his writings, particularly the Prolegomena to Ethics and the Principles of Political Obligation, it is quite clear that his thoughts form a systematic whole and fall into three parts, which are metaphysics, ethics, and political philosophy, in a systematic scheme where one leads to the other. The main focus in his Prolegomena to Ethics is the discovery of true vocation of man and the best possible way of achieving human well-being. But in order to know what true human well-being consists of, Green wants to discover the real nature of the individual, the nature of the universe, and the real purpose of man's place in it. Therefore, as an idealist, he starts with metaphysical premise, which leads him to ethical conclusions. Ethical conclusions facilitate him to discover the true goal of human life, which, in socio-political context, leads him further to formulate his political philosophy. Thus, only after having discovered the true goal of human life, Green proceeds to determine the conditions of social and political life in which it can best be realized. Therefore, his metaphysical and moral philosophy leads him into political philosophy, in which he discusses the ideas of freedom, rights, obligations, and the sovereignty of the state. The main purpose of his work, the lectures on the principles of political obligation, was to consider the moral function or object served by law or by the system of rights and obligations which the state enforces, and in doing so to discover the true ground of justification for obedience to law. Thus, Green's entire philosophy consists of three parts, which are metaphysics, ethics, and political philosophy. Before explaining his political philosophy in detail, it is pertinent to give a synoptic overview of his metaphysical and ethical philosophy. When we talk of Green's metaphysics, we find that the fundamental point in his metaphysical analysis of the nature of man is man's self-consciousness. According to him, man differs from the rest of animal creation in being self-conscious. The self-consciousness synthesizes the elements of our spiritual experience into a systematic unity in the same way in which a thread or a string passing through numerous beads constitute them into a whole. Thus, it is evident that in the metaphysical system visualized by Green, there are three elements: the self-conscious human being, the universe, and the God, which together constitute a whole. Now, we'll talk about the ethical aspect of Green's philosophy. According to Green, our moral life must be an unceasing struggle for the attainment of perfection or a higher life that we associated with God as an eternal consciousness or the divine spirit. The notion that eternal consciousness dwells in each human being and the true good of man is perfection of human life occupies a vital place in the thought of Green. And as a result of it, he arrives at several conclusions, which are: number one, man is something more than merely a part of nature. Number two, pursuit of pleasure cannot be the goal of life for a being who partakes in the eternal consciousness. Number three, the true good of man is the perfection of human life. At number four, Green believes that everyone is under a moral obligation to recognize and respect the good of other men. These ethical conclusions had a profound influence on Green's views on freedom, rights, obligations, sovereignty, and finally, the obedience to the laws of the state that will be discussed as the culmination of his political philosophy. We saw that as an idealist, Green starts with metaphysics, which leads him to the ethical conclusions, and both get synthesized in the culmination of his political philosophy. Green's political philosophy has been summed up by Professor Ernest Barker in the thesis that human consciousness postulates liberty. Liberty involves rights, and rights demand the state. Thus, it may take the shape of a pyramid. Green, in his political philosophy, like his predecessors, Rousseau and Kant, considers the problem of freedom as the greatest of all blessings and its attainment the true goal of our efforts as citizens. This is because human consciousness postulates freedom. The content of human freedom consists of various claims. The claims, when recognized by society and enforced by state, become rights. The enjoyment of rights demand a sovereign state. It is the state that makes laws and fixes obligations for their obedience. Green's views on freedom. Human consciousness postulates freedom. Hence, the starting point in Green's political philosophy is the concept of freedom. Green regards freedom as the capacity of doing or enjoying something worth doing or enjoying in common with others. The state should not interfere with this self-determination on the part of the individual by repressive interferences or excess of paternal government. The role of state activity is limited to hinder the hindrances to good life, which in simple words means removing the obstructions that lie in the way of our doing things worth doing. So it becomes clear that the freedom that Green talks about is not absolute power to do what one likes to do without let or hindrance. It is a positive power of pursuing those ideal objects which the good will presents to a self-conscious and self-realizing subject. Thus, the main features of freedom according to Green are: number one, human consciousness postulates freedom. Number two, freedom is the greatest of all blessings. Number three, it is the positive power of doing or enjoying something worth doing or enjoying. Number four, the real freedom is freedom to do something in common with others. Number five, the freedom to do something should be desirable as socially good. Number six, a man is entitled only to that degree of freedom which is socially approved as desirable. Number seven, there are reasonable restrictions which are morally and socially acceptable. Number eight, The role of state is to remove obstacles in the way of positive freedom. Number 9, the state has merely to hinder the hindrances in the good life of an individual in a civilized society. And finally, Green concludes that freedom involves rights as its corollary. Hence, we find in his lectures on the principles of political obligation that immediately after explaining the concept of freedom, Green moves ahead to explain the complementary nature of freedom and rights. So from here, we move to Green's views on rights. From Green's thesis that liberty involves rights, it follows that a right is a certain liberty claimed by an individual as necessary for pursuing ideal objects. But a claim for liberty of action becomes a right only when it is recognized by society. In the absence of such recognition, it remains only as an empty claim. Having said this, we move ahead to the final part of Green's thesis, that rights demand state. According to Green, society begins in the common consciousness of a common good. Green prefers to call common consciousness as general will. It is the common consciousness as general will that creates rights. Since rights need to be enforced, thus rights demand state. Hence, there must exist in every society a power that can enforce rights against all those who refuse to recognize the rights of others and place impediments in the way of their exercise. According to Green, will, not force, is the basis of state. As Green puts it, force may be necessary for restraining the minority of citizens in whom the civic sense is not properly developed, but it cannot be said to constitute the essence of state. A true state is one in which power is exercised according to law and for the maintenance of rights. It is an objective of this sort that converts power into legitimacy. Thus, according to Green, the real determinant of the habitual obedience of the people to the laws prescribed by it is their conviction that the laws are meant for their good and that the sovereign embodies and expresses the general will of the community. In this way, Green tries to show that the state does not arise out of a social contract, but is the result of the desire of men for a common good. The common good can best be realized in a state. Hence, Green concludes that common consciousness is general will that desires common good, for realization of which state becomes indispensable. It further leads him to give a more adequate solution to the problem of political obligation. In fact, his main purpose in his lectures on the principles of political obligation is to consider the moral function or object served by law or the system of rights and obligations which the state enforces, and to discover the true ground or justification for obedience of law. In his effort to define the true function of law and determine the ground of our moral duty to obey the law, he examines various theories of political obligation and the main rights and obligations enforced in civilized states. In this regard, Green first of all partially rejects the notion of natural rights and reinterprets them as ideal rights, which a society properly organized on the basis of goodwill should and would grant to its members. In the second place, Green rejects the notion of inconsistency of a rule or institution with the natural law. As a consequence, Green argues that the whole structure of liberal thought, from John Locke to utilitarians, needs to be revised. He partially rejects the doctrine of natural rights and then refutes the theory that rights are rooted in utility. Thus, Green's own interpretation to these issues laid the foundation of Oxford idealist school of thought, which was later renamed as English idealist school of thought. The English idealist school of thought, which in fact began with Thomas Hill Green, drew its inspiration from the philosophy of Plato, Aristotle, Rousseau, Kant, and Hegel. It was the reluctance of the British liberals towards German idealism that Green had to modify and restate the fundamentals of Hegelianism so as to make them palatable to the English taste. He did it by, number one, making the state less absolute. Number two, regarding the individual as an end. Number three, making the rights of an individual more secure. Number four, recognizing that under certain circumstances, resistance is justifiable. Thus, the main contribution of the English idealist school of thought to political philosophy is the assimilation of the individual and the state, and the insistence upon the unity of ethics and politics. The service rendered by Thomas Hill Green to political philosophy in general and the English idealist school of thought in particular can be summed up in the words of Viper, who very aptly remarks that here then is Green's achievement, that he gave Englishmen something more satisfying than Benthamism at a price they were prepared to pay, that he left liberalism a faith of an interest, that he made individualism moral and social, and idealism civilized and safe. Thus, Hegelian philosophy, modified as per English taste, began to replace the laissez-faire individualism. But before this could be done, those things which made it difficult for Englishmen to adopt it were first removed from Hegelianism. This was the arduous task that Green accomplished in a very short span of life. It ushered in the era of modern liberalism, which later became the theoretical basis of the modern welfare state. That's all we can say about the philosophy of Thomas Hill Green in this brief and informative lecture. Thank you very much for being with me.